Hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar on fashion climate action presented to you by the Apparel Impact Institute, an organization that identifies, funds, and scales proven environmental impact solutions in the apparel and footwear industry. There is no denying that our industry is in a state of emergency, as we all must work to meet 2030, 2050 targets to reduce GHG emissions. And the Apparel Impact Institute is on the front lines and is leading with solutions and research that they will be sharing with us today. We're so honored to have Louis Perkins, who many of you know, and he is the president of the Apparel Impact Institute. Louis oversees the collaboration of brands and manufacturers on the forefront of global efforts to reach the industry's sustainability goals. Louis was previously the president of Cradle to Cradle Product Innovation Institute, where he launched the Fashion Positive Initiative for Circular Materials. And also joining us today is Bryant Lepre, who serves as the Director of Industry Engagement, where he manages all programmatic brand, retail, and manufacturing relationships. Bryant also leads special projects to support the evolution and expansion of the Apparel Impact Institute's global work, including the LA-based work, which he will be discussing a bit later today. And just a reminder to all of our members that if you have any questions for Louis or Bryant, you can submit those in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So thank you, Louis. Thank you, Bryant, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Great. All right. Well, with that, we'll take it from here. So thank you so much for the introduction. And first of all, thank you to the CFDA. We continue to be so proud of our relationship with this organization and the many years in which I've been able to participate, previously with my role at Cradle to Cradle, and then today with my work with Apparel Impact Institute. And as introduced, Bryant Lepre is my colleague who is overseeing a lot of our brand partnerships and relationships, and also looking into some of the ways in which we're addressing climate action in specific regions. So today we're going to tell you a little bit about our organization and share what we're trying to work on related to climate, how our theory of change is being applied in some of our ambitious goals for the industry. And then Bryant's going to take it to a conversation about our work in Los Angeles, really focusing on the US market and sort of our leadership starting off in the US. All right, anything to add, Bryant, before we jump in?
No, I think we are ready to jump in.
Okay, great. So as introduced, this is the Apparel Impact Institute, and many of you may know something about us. We were founded in late 2017 as a rollout from the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, of which some of you may be members. But if you're not aware, the SAC was launched over a decade ago with key brand retailers such as Nike and Patagonia and Walmart and others who really helped launch an approach towards working together to understand how to improve the supply chain. And it began with launching common tools, such as their facility environmental module as part of the Higg Index. Many of you are probably familiar with that tool, and other suite of tools related to brands and materials that the SAC has managed and rolled out over the years. But in 2017, a group of key brands came together and said, you know, it is important that we have these data insights and that we're working alongside each other to roll out a baseline of what constitutes as, you know, environmental sustainability with our suppliers. But that data alone could be more useful if we took those data insights and actually applied them to scale specific solutions. And the industry recognized, we know there's a number of things we can get started on. So we'll talk a little bit about today about that origin. But the intent of spinning out the Apparel Impact Institute was to set us up as a 501c3, as a charitable foundation that would be able to work alongside not only brand retailer contributions, but also government grants and philanthropic contributions to identify, fund, scale, and measure environmental impact and potentially social impact as well in the supply chain that is shared by so many of the brand retailers. We're established in the US, but we work in many countries, and we have team members based in China and Germany, and I think as of recent Portugal. We're adding a team member there, but we are growing. So we see ourselves as a global team. And we also focus on regional needs by partnering with local organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, and technical experts in those countries. So our model is not to necessarily build resource capacity only in the West, but to actually partner with those resources on the ground. And we're leaning into our role that I would say is around the best way to get to collective action is not to present just one theory of change, but actually to create a center of gravity for all players along those lines of environmental sustainability, social and labor good. And so what we're doing is really positioning AII to be a clearinghouse with our partners around what sustainable programs are either ready to scale or could use proper resources or resourcing to get to scale. And so we see ourselves as a collective action, not only amongst the industry, brand retailers and their suppliers, but also across the nonprofits, many organizations. I mentioned the SAC, but we partner closely with Textile Exchange, Fashion for Good, UNFCCC Fashion Pact, UNFCCC Fashion Charter, the Fashion Pact, many others, Global Fashion Agenda. The list goes on, and I'll show you in a minute. But I just wanted to open up that we see ourselves as an aggregator of all the best-in-class impact projects that are happening so that we can align resources, align direction, and help drive the industry towards a common roadmap. And when I talk about the common roadmap, science-based targets, and that's sort of the last thing on this slide, is really leading a lot of our strategic direction for AII. It does not mean that land use, biodiversity, water, chemical management, and health are not critical KPIs for our organization and the industry as a whole. In fact, we very much scale programs that also have those additional measurements and KPIs. And so it's important to us that we don't think of just the tunnel vision of carbon, which we've heard others talk about having carbon tunnel vision, but potentially to also increase our lens to ensure that we're scaling programs as a more holistic approach towards continuous improvement. So with that, I will share a little bit more. I've rambled off some lists of who some of the founding organizations were that came to the table, but I want to share, who's working with AII and who do we consider this collective action approach that AII is helping to steer. And as I mentioned, our founding brands that came to the table were Target, Gap, and PVH, but soon joined by other partners like Arvin Mills and Artistic Milners to be part of what we call the Apparel Impact Roundtable. HSBC has been a contributing philanthropic funder to us, as well as IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative. Many of you may be familiar with their Vietnam work and Race to the Top, which is a key strategic program that we've been working with. And then I mentioned the NRDC here because the Clean by Design initiative, which many of you may be familiar with, that was created and launched at the NRDC by Dr. Linda Greer, has been stewarded by Kurt Kipka, who's our VP of Programs in Bryant and our program team in Beijing, and is now scaling globally. So working with the NRDC to transition that program over to the AII in order to help scale it across the industry was one of the primary reasons we were founded. So moving to the next slide then, it's not just those brands. And here we have a sampling of the companies that we're working with. I think this list could probably even be updated again because I think we're adding new company partners almost weekly to this list. But this gives you an idea of some of the companies who are working with us. And working with us means that we're not a membership. So what it means is that you're putting your sustainability budgets and your contribution towards supply chain improvements into a pooled fund model where AII works with you and as a company or a brand or designer. We work with you on identifying the suppliers that you want to work with and help leverage the funding that you've allocated to that work. And we match it with philanthropic when necessary, or if it no longer needs philanthropic matching, we are able to take it directly to a financial model that would work for the supplier. We oftentimes are also bringing, local funders or local partners to the table that may have additional funding. And so every program, every region looks a little different, but that's the beauty of this, is that we're able to aggregate those funds to really roll them out across different regions with different types of programs. And we'll talk a little bit more about the programs beyond just Clean by Design. So we also, as I mentioned, we don't recreate the wheel by building up a huge staff at AII to do the technical work. We partner with on-the-ground third-party partners that are our solution providers, and that list grows too. This is a train the trainer scale kind of approach towards ensuring that the programs and solutions that we're working with are distributed globally through the right partners who are already working with many of you or your suppliers on some of these environmental and social impact programs. And so we want to ensure that we're not duplicating the wheel, but rather properly resourcing experts and building more capacity, because that's a key thing that is needed in order to do this work, is to get more and more verified third-party solution providers working to scale solutions. And then finally, I'll mention some of our current collaborators. We work with two key groups: the fashion conveners and the alliance within the fashion industry, the Apparel Alliance, and many of those organizations are listed here. We also look to expand this list. This is not exhaustive. There are others that work with us, but this gives you an idea of some of the current collaborators that we're working with on reports, on carbon tracking, on programming, on tools alignment, data set alignment, and just identifying where some of the impact projects and programs they're running might be plugged into our program and to the way that we're looking at scaling solutions. Brian, is there anything that you want to add to any of our stakeholders before I move on?
No, nothing key. I think, it's nice for us as an organization to be able to work with, brands that are large, brands that are small. We're really able to adapt to any specific brand or retail partner in the structure of how we operate. So it's exciting that, that provides us a lot of flexibility and approach to our global work.
That's right. I think when a lot of these programs get started, oftentimes it's only the big brand retailers that are able to participate. And in order to open up a country or a region with a new program, you need some economies of scale. You need to know that you have enough factories, mills, suppliers that you're going to go into. But as we scale, the ability for a designer or brand to come to us and say, I have 3 identified suppliers in India I'd love to introduce to your work, that works for us. And I think that's something, you just mentioned, Bryant, but as we continue to grow, we want to ensure that all companies that want their supply chain to be more sustainable are able to plug into this system. And the bigger we get, the more economies of scale there are. And you may be overlapping with other brand retailers at the table who are also working in that same region, that same part of the country, and potentially the same supplier. And so that's actually great for us, because we can distribute resources even more widely when we're able to look at shared supply chains or shared regions. Great. So what do we do? I think I've talked a good bit about some of the ways in which we have been scaling programs like Clean by Design, but at the highest level, the reason AII was established was to help identify what is working and what's ready to scale. How do we properly fund that? And funding starts with corporate contributions and philanthropy. But if we get a solution far enough along and we know it's proven, not only from a performance standpoint, from ensuring that the quality of the product is actually going to be maintained, that the technology or the best practices work, they meet the KPIs to save water, measure chemistry use or lower chemical use, save energy, scale clean energy. Once we know these things work, then they're ready to scale beyond just philanthropic and corporate contribution. And so what AII is really moving into as well around this is the role that we can play to unlock other forms of capital across debt and equity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but think about us as not only identifying the solutions that are ready to scale, but potentially identifying some solutions that may not yet be there and where we can apply philanthropic or corporate grant funding to help pilot or test out a solution, to apply best practices and model them until they're actually getting the desired results. So identifying not only starts with what's working that we can scale, but also what may be started, but we don't yet know if it works, and we want to continue to pilot or model that out until we get the right results. Then apply the right funding in order to get it to scale. And then scalability is also about ensuring that the proper capacity and resources are in that country. So as I mentioned earlier around third-party solution providers, scalability happens when we have the resources of human capital, when we have the right trained people, when we have the ability to reach out to suppliers and recruit them into this work consistently, and then also when we're scaling these programs with the right technical resources and the right capital to do so. So our current programs, if you're interested, really address kind of these key areas, and we'll be sharing this information so you can get into it earlier. But what we really started with, as I mentioned, was around efficiency, and the Clean by Design program was then taken and put alongside some of the other mill improvement programs that are out there in order to align them, to coordinate them as sort of one consistent rollout of improvements for material, energy and resource efficiency within those facilities, tier 2. So programs like Solidaridad's Better Mill Initiative and STIWI at the Swedish Textile Water Initiative, Race to the Top with IDH I mentioned earlier, Clean by Design, they all are programs that have been evaluated and are part of a mill improvement alliance in order to ensure that we're scaling consistent programs with quality results, same in price point, consistent recruitment, et cetera. But that gave us an opportunity to also look at where you go beyond tier 2. And so what you see in here is taking some of those energy and water efficiency programs beyond tier 2 into tier 1 and tier 3. And we define tier 1 as cut and sew, tier 2 as wet processing or fabric prep, and tier 3 yarn prep. I know sometimes that raw material processing kind of happens between the tier 4 raw material inputs and also tier 3 yarn preparation. But as we look at, bringing some of those energy efficiency programs forward, chemical management programs, which we're partnered with ZDHC, wastewater treatment, energy efficiency, materials efficiency programs, coal phase out project, which we'll be happy to share more about that as it's being developed in the early stage, really looking at coal phase out related to thermal heat, but also electricity and scaling clean electricity as well. On-site renewables program, which we're rolling out in Vietnam currently, but look to replicate in other regions. And then also the supplier toolkit, which is designed to support manufacturers in setting carbon targets or directions. And we have a new tool that we rolled out with the HIG, you all may have seen, called the Carbon Tech Assessment. So we're happy to dive into all this, but what it tells you is that we do have more of a breadth of programming currently. But where AII also aims to go is to not just run our own programs, but also to look to identify, fund, and scale other programs that help us address climate, science-based targets and other climate metrics. And we're basing that on our roadmap report, which I'll talk about in a minute as well, too, that tells us where the carbon exists. Brian, anything else to share about these programs before I move on?
Nope. I think the one thing I would the one thing I would quickly add is the nice thing about this work is a lot of the items you see on the screen, 1 through 5, 1 through 6, we're able to operate in multiple countries that you would typically think are high production areas, the likes of mainland China, Taiwan, Vietnam, et cetera. So not only can we work with brands large and small, we have a pretty diverse presence across the world with some apparel production locations. So it's also a nice offering within this climate solutions portfolio, the coverage in this scale and the scope that we're able to achieve.
That's great. Thank you. So, and this slide really kind of gives you a sample. You may have seen this in our social media, or we have an impact report off our website that captures this, but it tells you just in the last year, and even in a pandemic time, that we were still able to reach a number of facilities, 50 facilities with our Clean by Design program, 200 facilities went through that carbon tech assessment that I mentioned, and 45 facilities that continue on in our carbon leadership project. So that was a good year considering that, 2020 leading into 2021, there was some questions around whether the supply chain would be operating in a way that we could actually go in with our programs. But what it tells you is that, we've been able to deploy programs not only during this time, but also scale it into new regions. We began the program Clean by Design with mainland China. And as we started working with some of the other programs, like I mentioned, IDH taking us into Vietnam, we're also able to expand into India Italy, Taiwan region, Pakistan, South Korea, and now the US, which we're going to talk about at the end of this call as well. And here's just, the savings. We really look at this as a way that we can report back based on every program or project that's run by region or throughout the year or the term of that program. We're able to report back on the greenhouse gas reductions, water savings, the capital that's invested, which is, again, as we help unlock more investment, our programs are creating the demand for potential debt and equity. So that is positive to lenders. And in some cases, bringing better financial terms to the suppliers is also advantageous to them as well. And then with all of our programs, we look to, if there is an ROI, and there is in the case of Clean by Design, then we want to be able to share that payback period over time as we look at it almost like a portfolio investment, like you're looking at your investment of dollars in, unit of carbon out, unit of water saved, and as well as the return on investment and what that financial saving is to the facility. So these facilities are putting some small level of investment in up front, but on the back end, they're saving on water and energy. Brian, anything else to add?
Nope.
All right, great. So I mentioned that we've done some reports, and I'm excited about sharing this with you. They're listed on our website. The first big report that we did, and we started this work in 2019 with a workshop at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition's annual member meeting that was really looking at where is the carbon in the supply chain. And what it did was it really informed us around 6 key levers. We call them the levers in the report of where we can invest in and scale solutions in order to lower the carbon. And I think it's in one of the slides, but I'll go ahead and say it. They are material efficiency, preferred better materials, which includes regenerative farming practices on organic cotton or other types of better cotton, and recycled poly, man-made cellulosics, scaling preferred and better materials with lower carbon footprint. The third is next generation materials, some of these really leading new materials that are being made in a circular economy manner or made from materials that have lower carbon and lower material resource burden as a raw material input. And then on the manufacturing and facility side, the other 3 levers were energy efficiency, renewable electricity across all facilities and buildings, and thermal heat innovation, which would mean helping to contribute to eliminating coal burning on site for thermal heat that's dyeing and processing and finishing our fabrics, but instead looking at new dry processing technologies or renewable thermal technologies that are out there. So those are the 6 key areas that the report identified, and also a very solid nod to circularity and circular systems, as a lot of those areas have inputs of circular resources back into the system. So do take a look at that report. It's the Roadmap to Net Zero report that was created with World Resource Institute and with generous support from Loudis Foundation. Now on this slide, what you see is the follow-up report, which we launched just, I think, a week after we launched the first report. And we developed this report, which we called the size of the prize as we were building it, because it was, how much are we talking about? We're telling the industry to basically transition its carbon footprint through all of these investments and innovations and best practices. What's that going to cost? And so we took those 6 levers and we put a size of the prize associated with each of the levers. And so we call this report Unlocking the $1 Trillion Opportunity. It was developed with Fashion for Good and support with HSBC Bank. And it helped us identify how much funding would be applied to the apparel supply chain between now and 2050, so over the next 28 years, in order to decarbonize the fashion industry. And here is a little bit more on the money related to that. So if you were taking copious notes while I rattled off the 6 levers, here they are in orange, with the 7th, our nod to circularity and circular business models is number 7. We haven't yet put a number around circularity. We know Ellen MacArthur Foundation's done a great job in some of that work, so that may come next in a future report. But right now, what we can tell you is we know how much carbon roughly, and this is based on Higg data, textile exchange data, and other data sets that we had, the best that we could get. And that helped us know where the carbon is in the supply chain. So you can see in the raw material, 24%, in tier 3, 15%, in tier 2, 52%. So wet processing, where we are using coal primarily on a global basis to heat up the process for thermal heat, is contributing to about half of the carbon in the supply chain. And then finally, finished product assembly. So you can look at each one of these levers and you can see if it hits that tier. So obviously maximizing energy efficiency happens across all of it. And that is a cost that, we can calculate as well too, but we really wanted to lean into some of the areas where we thought there was external investment. So scaling preferred materials and practices, we think, is a $218 billion opportunity based on the report. Accelerating next generation materials, $272 billion. Maximizing energy efficiency, which is like the Clean by Design program and others that are established for that, $22 billion. Eliminating coal in material and product manufacturing. This is that thermal heat intervention and disruption, $153 billion. And finally, the shift to 100% renewable electricity across all tiers in the supply chain production would be $380 billion. So some big numbers. The report goes on to also break down a little bit more on each of the areas that we mentioned and how much would be philanthropic, how much should be corporate contribution, how much is an opportunity for private equity and impact investment, and how much is potentially going to be debt or concessionary finance or lending to suppliers around these technologies and interventions and other capital expenditures. So,
hey, Lewis.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, really. Could you go back to that slide? We have a question. I think this is a great opportunity just to answer. So the question is, do you see any special potential for New York-based brands, producers, and suppliers in being able to make progress in climate action? And I'm going to answer this question in 2 ways. The first is going to be an assumption that maybe those New York-based brands, producers, or suppliers are sourcing potentially globally or having that product produced outside of maybe the New York area. So in that sense, I think this slide here provides a great representation of different ways to consider getting involved in some of the different climate action initiatives. However, if then the second assumption is maybe they're producing within New York, there's some apparel companies there doing actual production, I think the answer also is yes. And we'll cover a little bit more of that and how we potentially are looking at doing some US-based work specifically within LA and what that replication will look like. Typically speaking, just a nod is going to be potential for renewable energy is one of the key areas and aspects of that work as it relates to climate action. So that's how I'd answer that question in sort of 2 different ways as it relates to the climate action for New York-based brands.
That's great, Brian. Thank you for pointing out that, and let's continue to scan for these questions that are coming in. I'm happy to stop and pause. Thank you for that answer. And I would also add, some of the decision making that happens in selecting certain types of materials, which is showing up under the 1, 2, and 3 levers, will also be a big part of that. And some of the new technologies around laser cutting or zero pattern making, et cetera, also contribute to maximizing material efficiency. So there's a lot of ways in which these types of technologies and interventions can be applied in any region. And then I'll also say, when we talk a little bit about our LA work, LA came to us because we had a potential funding focus with Bank of the West and some of the brands we were talking to and some of the suppliers in LA. But we are an on-demand organization in many ways. When there is a concentration of partners that want to go into a region, we will open up work there. So just keep that in mind as we look at where production is happening in the US, Central America, other areas in which you may be sourcing that you didn't see in our list, because if we do our work right, we're going to go everywhere. And I'll share that ambition next, which is in response to these reports, what we're doing is we're trying to create a larger, I think I used the term center of gravity earlier, but we're trying to create a larger center of gravity. We know that this climate work is expensive and requires resources. And so we believe that we can aggregate more funding from philanthropy, government grants, and industry in order to unlock more innovation, to open up new regions, to create new cohorts in places like New York, or I just mentioned Central America, North Africa. There's a lot of regions we're not yet in, but we anticipate going into. We opened up a project in Italy because of the luxury industry that's very interested in having us there. So that work has been kicked off. So again, we see there's a really big opportunity for AII to help organize and pool the funding across the unlock and opening of opportunities and some of the research and development that's needed to pilot some of these new technologies and solutions. Many of them are happening in other industries, but we haven't yet tested them on textiles. So again, I mentioned earlier that we see ourselves as this clearinghouse of vetting improvement programs and other interventions or innovations. And we do that with a consortium of technical experts and advisors. It's not just AII staff who's making these decisions. We work with some of the best advisors on this sector, in this space, in the industry. So as we play that role and continue to raise more funds, we've set out, and you may have read it in Sourcing Journal, to pool or to call the industry to contribute, and we will pool it $250 million into the Climate Fashion Fund. And that fund will be used as grant making and contributions into the supply chain, into developing out program solutions, testing and piloting, early stage, where we actually can de-risk and proof point solutions that make it ready for debt and equity. And as a result of that, we're also building a registry of these solutions that will be made available to partners who can see what programs are running, so that you'd have some visibility into the types of programs across those 6 levers in the report within a region. What's happening around material efficiency in Bangladesh, what's happening around clean energy in Taiwan region. You'd have that visibility. What's happening in preferred materials in India, et cetera. So we're developing out that tool. We have industry partners who are helping to build it, and we're going into beta development this year to have that tool be tested as a resource, not only to the brands and their suppliers and sourcing teams, but to the manufacturers in the supply chain or the other suppliers at Tier 4 who are able to see what programs might be eligible in their region, where they might be able to apply to receive funding or to get recruited into a cohort of programming. It also allows us to provide this as a tool for the debt and equity players and philanthropists to be able to see what programs are eligible for funding or have been de-risked for investment. So we're pretty excited about the tool. We think it's going to be a pretty powerful one, and we're in the scoping out business requirements phase right now, and we invite others to join. Bryant, I'm going to pause and see if you have anything you want to add or any questions come in.
Nope, we are good to keep on moving.
Okay, good. And I'm tracking time too, because I'd really like to save some time at the end for Q&A. So I'm just making sure we're following, and I leave enough time to talk about California. So we really just wanted to make this announcement to the CFDA membership and partners today that we are launching this Fashion Climate Fund. We are building a portfolio registry tool to align the funding into programming to make it a much more transparent and visible approach towards what's happening, what stage of development from early, mid to late stage, what type of funding is needed for it, whether it's a corporate contribution or whether it's philanthropy or private equity investment or debt, to be able to bring more resources and players to a transparent and visible roadmap to what I like to say is let's operationalize all these visions into one direction to reduce carbon. And I didn't say it, but our goal is to reach decarbonization by 2050. I think I might have said that, but also the 2030 goal, which is a minimum of 45% or higher, basically cutting the carbon in half by 2030. So that's the purpose of this goal. And we've identified that with the 250 million, we'd be able to unlock another 2 billion in capital towards reducing emissions over the next 8 years. So we're working very closely with debt and equity partners to be able to align some of the allocated funding that they're putting together towards climate action and really try to route it into this industry so that we can get better access to better terms, better capital that can go into the supply chain. And in many cases, ensuring that we're not just putting debt on the backs of our suppliers, but we're looking at creative ways in which we can scale, whether it's through power purchase agreements or other equity. And I think I just have one or two other slides so I can turn it over to Bryant. But overall, when you're asking about how much we're talking about, currently we're operating this way at AII already with I think when we put this slide together a few weeks back, it was 4 million. I think we've increased closer to 5 or higher now. So we're building and growing rapidly. But with this fund, we'd be able to really unlock. We'd be deploying about $30 million a year rather than $4 million a year. And we'd be able to unlock a total of $2 billion towards the 2030 goal. And that would remove a lot more carbon, as you can see from here. And then finally, as we break it down, I've mentioned, and you can go to the full report on our website to see all the graphics and sort of the breakdown of this. But we know that philanthropic and corporate contribution is early and mid stage, but that as we get into scale, we're really looking to unlock, the greater levels of debt and equity. So this kind of shows you where the asset class happens across the maturity from early, mid to late stage, or we call it pre-seed, pilot, model, and scale. We're putting together an advisory council around this for use of funds. We're happy to have a call with any of you to share more about that. But as I mentioned earlier, we use some of the best experts. And once the fund gets going, it'll be an opportunity for solution providers to apply. So there's potential programs on the left for program intake to be able to apply for being listed in the registry and being able to receive funding towards pre-seed, pilot, model, scale. So this is a visual that shows how that decision making will be happening as we vet programs against a core criteria, which will be different by stage of development and by type of program. And with that, I think I'm done on my part, so I can turn it over to Bryant. But do we have any other additional questions that came in before? We'll open it up for Q&A at the end as well.
Yeah, nothing's come in, so I will go ahead and jump in here. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now to a little bit more of a specific example here with our work that we're doing within I call it the greater Los Angeles area with our clean by design pilot. In context on this, Lewis did a nice job of setting it up before in the discussion about this idea of brand demand, brand interest. And if we go back to last year, we had done a lot of our work historically, globally, overseas in predominant apparel production countries that we shared earlier, mainland China, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, and then started to have a few brands and one philanthropic funder come to us and say, have you ever thought about doing work in the greater LA area? And at first we said, yeah, it's come up. We just we haven't done anything. We don't know why. And so what we started to do is rather than making assumptions, we wanted to take a step back and really take this methodical approach of saying, how can we do a feasibility study over last year to determine what the market really needs? And Lewis, if you want to go ahead, it's one slide here. It led us into the objectives here on the screen. And so these are really, it was the first phase, again, the feasibility phase of what we wanted to do. So rather than making assumptions, we went in and said, let's do 3 things. Let's determine what those needs are for the greater LA area and those apparel producers, both tier 1 and tier 2. So those mills or dye houses, but then also knowing that there's some nuanced tier 1 facilities, some cut and sew, finished goods, some screen printers. There's a variety of different production types happening in the LA area. What are their needs and what would we be able to support? Similarly, looking at what are those high impact issues for industry and stakeholders. So not just necessarily looking at the brands or the manufacturers, but what about those additional stakeholders in the greater LA area? And that's what resulted in the second bullet point. And then once we've done that, based on everything we've heard, everything we've seen, what could be some concepts that we could take outside of the feasibility phase into our pilot model? And so what we started to hear on the next slide is the results that came out of the feasibility phase. So I'll kind of just highlight some of the different things. What we started to hear is sort of these 4 key areas of this. What are those market conditions? Some of the infrastructure, the equipment is a little bit older. Supplier needs are business first. Some of the markets a little bit smaller. The orders are significantly different than what you might expect on a global level. So how do we ensure we understand those business needs? When it becomes time to talk about what is that demand, so as we're looking at what do we think they need, we assumed maybe there was this idea for energy efficiency, but what we heard through the research is that materials and waste are a high brand concern specifically to the LA area. Suppliers want solutions as they think about what they can do. They didn't necessarily want somebody saying you have to do a program, but what is that program going to provide? For example, maybe you should replace your boiler if there is one. Maybe we should look at putting solar panels on the roof. So getting much more tangible and solutions oriented is what those suppliers wanted. Size of industry and impact was another one where now if we're looking at what is the industry craving, this idea of renewable energy, looking at also social issues. So that was a very different concern here, typically speaking for our work, predominantly focused on environmental issues, but social rose in a lot of those conversations. But one of the most important things that came out of this research is that we talk about this market is boutique and it's not high volume. So how do we take a step back and reconsider, which led us to the fourth finding as we think about this work, this operational requirement is redefining impact for AII specific to any work we might do within the US, maybe North America, or specifically the LA market. So it was an aha when a lot of people told us, think about the market differently. It's more specialized, it's boutique. You can't think about approaching the work in the same way. And those were the findings that came out of the feasibility study, which then allowed us to kind of look at some of the current state work, which is on the next slide here, of being able to say, what's really in the market. And what we found through working with both the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and the HIG databases, we found about 40 key facilities that were of varying sizes, but potential strong base for recruitment. We had about 15 large multinational brands who actually have a sourcing presence within the LA market, which is a surprise for us. Obviously, procurement volumes might be a little bit different, but having those multinationals in the market was a great learning. And then once we go back to then other stakeholders and funders is looking at local market contacts, having a strong presence there. The nice thing is we've made some strong relationships with government officials and family foundations who continue to serve as thought partners in providing us direct support within the LA market. And the exciting thing is now if we just go to the next slide and where we're really at in a lot of the work is taking a very thoughtful approach. And you see here on the screen, these are the pilot concepts that we created. So there was 5 in total. What we have, what we have in focus now is this idea of energy efficiency. So looking at tier 1, again, I mentioned if it's the possibility of a cut and sew, finished goods assembly, spinner. How do we take those best practices looking at energy efficiency and get to those facilities? Energy, water, and chemical efficiency for wet processing facilities. We know there's about 5 large wet processing facilities within the LA market. How can we work with them on these best practices for energy and water efficiency, chemical reduction? And then the interesting thing that we found through the work over the last couple of months is originally we had renewable energy as a third option or this standalone pilot. What we've started to glean now and what we're shifting into is maybe more of a focused approach on both energy efficiency and renewable energy. So how do we combine renewables into the first 2 things that you see, energy efficiency, tier 1, and then for wet processing. So integrate it rather than keep it separate. And that was based on stakeholder feedback. In focus for the future are 2 additional concepts that we're still working through, but based on brand demand, some of the funding, we're putting these in focus here in the future over the next year or so. Things around waste and circularity, but also this important idea of apparel convener roundtable. And this is one thing that we heard from a number of stakeholders, and I use that word broadly from the brands, the manufacturers, government officials. Everyone said that there was a huge need and opportunity for all of these apparel sector stakeholders to get together, to share best practices, to share learnings, to work collectively together, rather than separate or disconnected conversations that typically are happening right now. So that was a big thing that we're still working through, but in focus for the future. Then if we go to the next slide, which I believe is going to be the last one on the concept here, these are actual results. So in the feasibility phase, we were lucky enough to actually conduct a few tier 1 pilots. And so what we found is you start to compare the results for the global on the bottom here. Typically speaking, our global results are looking at about a 10.5% energy reduction, just about 10% reduction for greenhouse gases, and then about a 14.2-month payback. If we then compare the results for the tier 1 facilities that we did, seeing a 17% reduction, so higher than what we expected and what we see globally, looking at a 40 metric ton greenhouse gas reduction. So that metric ton there compared to the LA market, that's a fairly significant reduction potential in metric tons, a little bit below the average that we do see globally, but nonetheless still an important metric. And then a nice payback of less than a year, so 0.85 months. So just doing the low to no cost improvements represented a significant opportunity. And this is looking at air compressors, lighting upgrades, some operational changes to the equipment. This was in a spinning facility. This did not include the concept of rooftop solar, knowing that there's a pretty significant investment there. We felt holding that investment separately, not to skew the results, because that would drastically change the payback just with the investment. And so very happy with the results that we have seen as it relates to this tier 1 pilot, in which we're taking forward now. We do have one tier 2 textile facility currently in program. We are also recruiting additional facilities with the goal of hitting about 8 to 10 tier 1 facilities over the next probably 4 months. And that includes from getting them enrolled through first site visits and actual doing planning with those facilities. So that's kind of an update and an exciting development that we have going on right now within the LA market, is those additional 8 to 10 facilities for this year. And then Lewis, anything you would add? I think this takes us to sort of the last few slides transition. So I'll hand it back to you to kind of wrap up more on LA and then head into the Q&A. Oh, Lewis, you're muted. Okay.
Sorry about that. Sometimes the mute is hidden. Okay. Thanks, Brian. Great job on talking about the LA work. And I think it gives you it gives us a nice kind of overview on how we do look at ensuring that we're not just going in with a cookie cutter approach to every region, that there's unique problems that need to be solved. And we want to make sure that we're working with those local interests and listening and understanding as we aim to bring some of our programs and solutions to the table. I answered some of the questions that were in the Q&A while Bryant was talking. And one of them was really, and I'll just kind of bring it back to us, how small brands can work with us. And I shared that, the beauty is that if we're already in regions, we encourage companies to come to us, even if they have, a small number of suppliers they want to nominate, that they would work in our cohorts. And then potentially, as we start to look at the demand of other regions, that the small companies can also help drive that too. Brian, do you want to say anything about how you've worked with SMEs or how you think about small, medium brands?
Yeah, we think about those in a couple exciting different ways. As we talk about collaboration, this idea of generally we know that one brand is probably sharing similar suppliers. And so it's an idea of what we call co-nomination or collaboration, and how can we bring a brand regardless of their size together. So what you might have is maybe 2 to 3 brands working with a single supplier in unison, where they can support each other, they can offset costs. And so it's less about one brand going alone and looking at collaboration. Another way that we've had some interesting work is with 2 organizations, the Outdoor Industry Association and the European Outdoor Group. So rather than us maybe trying to bring the brands together and their suppliers, using these industry groups who bring multiple brands, who then will bring multiple suppliers to the table. And we're able to manage and execute our programs, but through different industry working groups. And so those are a couple different ways we're able to engage with some of the smaller brands or enterprises that might have a need for this type of work, potentially maybe not the same resources. And so it's a way to offset, to share, to collaborate by bringing more to the table.
That's great. Thank you. And then there was another question about, would we ever do consumer facing work and get some of this great information out to consumers? The way we currently do, we publish all our reports and try to get them out to the wire so they can be reached. But specifically, we're not funded to go directly to the consumers, but we partner with organizations who do. And so our intent is to increase that. I think it is really critical that consumers or citizens, purchasers of fashion, know what's out there and what's happening so they can make informed decisions. And so we plug into a lot of those third-party evaluations of how companies are doing, and they reference our programs and which brands are actually scaling improvements with AI. So that's something that happens formally or informally as we make all of our information transparent on our website and in our reports, that a lot of those consumer-facing groups do leverage and report on AI work. Bryant, would you want to say anything else about, sort of the way consumers find out about us?
No, I think that, outside of the consumer conversation, how it relates, I think, we report facility level information. So we're able to then have access to all of that data with improvements and make that as available as much as we can around reduction in carbon, how much they've saved, what are those environmental benefits or attributes. So that is one thing that we appreciate about our work, is we're able to stand behind that information. I would say, I think this is an industry-wide potential concern as we think more about access to data, longevity, 2030, 2050 goals, is different carbon accounting principles. And so how might, if we have access to facility level information, do brands then account for their reduction allocations or the methodologies that go into that? And so we know, as part of this work, one of the next phases is, how does that evolve for the industry and what are the appropriate accounting principles? And there's a lot of conversation happening there. And so we're well aware of that and also involved in those discussions as well.
Yep, that's great. This has been a great conversation. I think as I was going to wrap up, really as we're reaching out to different groups, and CFDA has been, as I opened up at the beginning of the talk, such a strong supporter and partner of all our work since we launched. I think we're always seeking more partners, and anyone who's interested in coming to work with us, we'd love to talk with you about your needs and help align it. And as Bryant pointed out, I think oftentimes the question is, well, am I big enough to actually affect impact? And hopefully today you heard through the way we work with bringing small, medium enterprise brands to the table alongside the bigger brands and shared supply chains, that the answer is yes, you are, and that every bit counts. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Louis. Thank you so much, Brian. I mean, the work you are all doing is so tremendous and impactful, and we promise to share with everyone who attended today, and also everyone who is watching this recording later on, how to get a hold of the Apparel Impact Institute, how to join, how to learn more and take action. So you'll have those resources in your inbox. All you need to do is ask. And thank you so much for leading this incredible presentation today.
That's great. And if California in particular is of interest, do ping us on that front too, because we're actively bringing partners to the table around that. So
absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that note. All right. Take care. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.